In the previous module, we have implemented the UI project of the Friend Organizer application with a view model, and a data service. In the data service, we have created fake data that we displayed in the user interface. Now we want to load real data from SQL Server. So we will set up Entity Framework code first in the Data Access project to create and seed a SQL Server database. Entity Framework code first means that we create the database from our code. We have already the friend model, and we will set up an Entity Framework DB context that is using that friend model. Then we can create as part of our Data Access project a so-called code first migration. We can apply this migration to SQL Server to create the database for us. And this database will then have a friend table like we have defined it in our code. When we have Entity Framework set up, the question is where we instantiate the Entity Framework DB context. The Entity Framework DB context is used to connect to SQL Server. There are many patterns around how to use the DB context. You could use, for example, the repository pattern. In the Friend Organizer application, we don't want to over-engineer things. We want to be pragmatic. So we will instantiate the Entity Framework DB context in the data service of the Friend Organizer application to connect to SQL Server. The Data Access project will just contain the DB context class and the code first migration that we have generated. Now let's start to set up Entity Framework code first so that we can create a database in SQL Server. In this demonstration, we will set up Entity Framework code first. You learn how to create a DB context subclass before you add a code first migration to the Data Access project. Then we will also add some constraints to our friend model, and finally you will create and seed the database in SQL Server. Let's start now with the DB context subclass. Here we are back in the Friend Organizer solution. Now let's add a DB context subclass to the Data Access project. To do this, we need to reference Entity Framework. So I right-click on the references and I choose Manage NuGet Packages. Then I browse for Entity Framework. I select Entity Framework and I install the latest stable version. Let's confirm this dialog and let's also accept the license. Now a reference to Entity Framework has been added to our Data Access project. So now we can add a DB context subclass. I call the class Friend Organizer DB context. Let's make the class public and let's inherit from DB context. I press Ctrl dot and you see we need a using for system data entity. So I add that using and I also remove the unnecessary usings. In the Friend Organizer DB context class, we can now create a public property of type DBSet of friend. So let's add a using for Friend Organizer model so that we can access the friend class. And I call that property friends. Over this DB set, we can load and save friends by using the Friend Organizer DB context. Now let's also create a constructor here. And let's call the base constructor by using the overload that takes the name of the connection string. So I just pass in a name for a connection string that we will specify in the app.config file later. I pass in the name Friend Organizer DB. Before we specify the connection string in the app.config file, I want to override a method in our DB context class. Let's override the onModelCreating method. By default, Entity Framework will pluralize the table names, but I want the table names to be singular. So here in that overridden method, we can grab the model builder parameter and we can grab its conventions property. And by calling the remove method on that property, we can remove a convention that is added by default, like the pluralizing table name convention. So let's remove that one. Pluralizing table name convention. I press Ctrl dot and here you see we need a using for system data entity model configuration dot conventions. So I hit enter. Now we have set up our DB context and later we don't have a pluralized table name. The table will just be called friend and not friends. Now the last thing I want to do in this clip, I want to add a connection string with this name to the app.config file. So let's open up the app.config file and let's add this connection string. The config sections element needs to be the first element in the configuration. So let's just add the connection strings element after this config sections element. Here we add an add element and we set the name to the name that we have used in the friend organizer DB context. Friend organizer DB. I just copy this and I paste it here in the app.config file. Now let's also set the connection string attribute on that add element. As a data source, I want to use my local SQL Server default instance. The initial catalog should be the friend organizer database that is just called friend organizer. With this name, the database will be created in SQL Server. The final thing I need to specify on this connection string is how I log in. I could specify username and password, but in this case I want to use my Windows account. So I choose Integrated Security. And I set this to true. As a last thing, I also set the provider name attribute on that add element. We want Entity Framework to use the ADO.NET classes from the namespace System Data SQL Client to connect to SQL Server. That's it. This is our connection string configured in this app.config file. Now let's switch back to the friend organizer DB context class. With this class we can connect to the database and we can load and save friends. But we don't have a database yet. The next step on our way to a database with Entity Framework Code First is to create a Code First migration. In the previous clip, we have created this friend organizer DB context class that inherits from DB context. We will use this class later to access the database. Over the friends property that is of type DBSetOfFriend, we will be able to load and save friends to the friend table. But for now we don't have a database yet. We need to create it. The next step after creating this friend organizer DB context class is to add a code first migration to our data access project. This code first migration will include the code that we need to create a friend table in the SQL Server database. Before we can add such a code first migration, we need to enable migrations for the data access project. To do this, I go to Tools, I select NuGet Package Manager and I open up the Package Manager console. In the console, I enter the command Enable Migrations. The command is not case sensitive. You can also write all the characters in lowercase if you prefer that. Before I hit enter, I need to select my data access project as a default project. Now the Enable Migrations command will look for a DB context subclass in the data access project. I hit enter to execute the command. Now the command has executed and you can see Code First Migrations enabled for project Friend Organizer Data Access. We have now this new migrations folder in our data access project. It contains a configuration class that is already open here. The configuration inherits from a DB migrations configuration class that is using our friend organizer DB context. Now when I scroll a bit down, you can see that this configuration class contains a seed method and it has the friend organizer DB context as a parameter. There is a comment that shows how to use that seed method. I just remove that comment and we add the code to seed the friend table in our database. So I use context.friends and I call the add or update method. An overload takes an identifier expression that is used to identify the object. I want to identify my friends by first name. So I assume if the first name exists in the database, I want to update the friend, and if the first name does not exist, I want to add it. Now after this identifier expression, I can pass in the new friends to that add or update method. Okay, looks good to me. We have the seed method in this configuration class. Now with the Code First Migrations enabled, we can add the migration to our data access project. I go again to the Package Manager console and I call the command add migration and I specify a name for the migration. I call the migration initial database. I hit enter and now the migration will be created based on the information that Entity Framework can read from the Friend Organizer DB context class. When you work with Entity Framework Code First, you will always call this add migration command whenever you have changed the model. Then you can apply the migration to the database by calling the update database command. Later we will also see that update database command. Now you see the migration command is done, and it says this migration file includes a snapshot of your current code-first model. When I open up Solution Explorer, you can see that we have here a new file that has the name that we have entered after the add migration command, initial database, and it has also a timestamp in front. Inside this file you can see a class called initial database, the name that we have entered, that inherits from DB migration. The class contains two methods, an up method to apply the changes and a down method to revert the changes. In the up method, you can see that a friend table is created. It has the columns ID, first name, last name, and email. You can also see that the ID is automatically set as identity and as primary key. Entity Framework has a convention that it automatically takes an ID property of a class as a primary key. You don't need to do anything in addition. But before we create the database with this code-first migration, I want to add some constraints. I want the first name to be a required property, like we have it here with the nullable false on the ID, and I want all the string properties, first name, last name, and email, to have a maximum length of 50. So let's see how we can apply these constraints before we create and seed the database.